So most of you would have seen from the meetup invite, our guest is Patrick Kua. Very excited that he's given his time to chat to us today and join us. Pat, if I'm correct, you're based in Berlin at the moment.
That's correct. I'm based in Berlin, Germany.
Yes. So yeah, so one of the perks of doing these meetups online is it's allowed us to host people from and have guests from outside South Africa. Yeah, and then I'm just going to do a quick intro about Pat and then just chat a bit about what we're going to talk about. So Pat is an established tech leader with almost 20 years of experience. His personal passion is accelerating the growth and success of tech organizations and technical leaders. He's had many years of hands-on experience leading and managing and improving complex organizations and software systems. He's been the CTO and chief scientist of N26, based out of Berlin in Germany. And before he was a technical principal consultant at ThoughtWorks. He's a frequent keynote and conference speaker. He's also an author of 3 books, the Retrospective Handbook, Talking with Tech Leads, and Building Evolutionary Architectures. Pat also runs a free popular newsletter for leaders in tech, which is called Level Up. You can find the details on his website for that newsletter. I actually follow that newsletter and it's really, really good. Lots of good content on tech leadership that comes out every week on a Sunday. Pat is also running the Tech Leadership Academy, where he offers online training for technical leaders. And I just wanted to share that I actually have a copy of Talking with Tech Leads, which is a book I read when I just become a manager a couple of years back, and it's really great. It's got Pat's interviewed quite a number of technical leaders across the world, and they chat about their experiences in leadership. And that book exposed me to the idea that different people can have different leadership styles and would still all be doing well, even though they approach their problems differently. So yeah, I'm sure we'll chat a bit more about Pat's other books and this book itself as we go into the talk for tonight. So yeah, so very, very excited just looking at that profile and all those details. For today, what we're going to do is what would be known as a fireside chat or just a conversation. I've got a series of questions which I'll ask Pat, and that will allow us to have a conversation, and he'll go a bit more detail into his career and into tech leadership and everything around that. We are also going to open up the floor for everyone who's attending the meetup to ask questions. I'm going to drop a link to Slido and a code that you can use. I'm dropping it in the chat now. As we're going through the meetup, feel free to add your questions there. And Benny and Roberto, the other organizers, will also look through those questions as we go along. And we'll use some time to look at those questions that you guys submit and let Pat also answer those questions. Yeah, and I'll repeat that as we go through the meetups, that we always have those questions. So yeah, welcome, Pat. Really excited to have you with us. And yeah, perhaps let's start with you telling us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into tech itself? How did you then transition into tech leadership and what you do now?
Yeah, thank you very much for the warm welcome, Tanaka. And it's really great to take part. I mean, the current state is very strange in the world, but it gives us some upsides, like being able to take part in this without jet lag or very long trips. So very happy to contribute to your sort of community. You know, in terms of answering how I got into tech, you know, I didn't start programming as a kid. I kind of fell into this in sort of high school. I studied in Australia and grew up in Australia, and one of the subjects that we were studying was called Information Computing Technology. So this is a bit more like IT, where you're learning about like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and those sorts of things. And one of the things there was actually a project where we were programming in Access back in the day. So we were actually building, I think it was a film database. So if you can imagine where you used to rent out CDs or videos that became eventually DVDs. We had to build a whole system based on that. And I just felt a little, I felt quite enchanted by programming. And so I sort of decided that's what I'd like to study. Went to university where I studied business and information technology. But I realized pretty early on I really liked the sort of information technology side. And so particularly liked the programming side. And I think the thing that really, still enchants me today is kind of this ability to create something out of nothing. So, being able to take an idea, to type in some random instructions into a computer, and then, come up with a system that, is useful. And, that itself is just very fascinating. I've been very, I guess, focused on learning. And I think that's what, for me, differentiates a really good sort of engineer programmer from other people, is that you're always curious. There's just so much to learn in terms of new tools or new platforms. And that skill itself and learning has really helped me sort of transition into sort of more senior leadership roles. So when I started working, I eventually ended up joining ThoughtWorks as a consultant. Started off with them in Australia and then moved to the UK. And I think this sort of passion for learning helps me understand, how to deal with different business domains, so different clients. But also as a consultant, you get thrown into so many different situations and roles. And so you have to be able to be adaptable and flexible to that. People can get similar experiences if they maybe do contracting, or if they're maybe working for a larger company and they try to do sort of like a tour of duty in different roles across different sort of teams or departments. But one of the benefits of consulting is that I got exposed to lots of different organizations and domains and skills. And so that essence of learning was really helpful in helping me sort of adapt to that. And it kind of is a bit natural that as you learn, you're looking for bigger problems. And one of the bigger problems is not necessarily just writing code as part of a team, but actually then leading a team, because it's one of those things where you can have a lot more impact. And I'm pretty sure that everyone here has probably worked with a team where the team leader was not so effective, or the technical lead was not so effective. And for me, that was actually a really good experience. I think a lot of people go through this, of trying to be a good sort of leader based on having worked perhaps under a poor leader, and you're sort of doing the opposite of perhaps of some of the things that they were doing, or maybe not taking attention of. And so that sort of learning ability helped me really focus on really understanding leadership. And particularly when I was leading my first technical team, the thing that I remember telling myself is that, my role is not necessarily to tell everyone what to do, because I'm working with a whole bunch of talented engineers, some of them who have much more experience than I have. It doesn't make sense for me to pretend I know, because they will know pretty quickly that I don't know what I'm saying, right? So the thing that is missing is the ability to bring people together, to surface, quiet voices, or to make sure that there's a decision or an outcome when there's so many different strong opinions. And that was something that I could add value in as a leader. And to what you were saying before, Tanaka, around like people being different leadership styles, something that I felt I was able to work on pretty early on in my sort of career. As I did more consulting, the scope sort of starts to increase a bit. So instead of working with perhaps one team, it's then working with teams of teams or across different departments. And as a consultant, I found myself working alongside more senior sort of either technical leadership roles, like more senior architects, or more senior management roles, so like a VP or a director of engineering, or even the CTO, helping them think about their technical strategies, or even just their organization as people were looking to adopt things like agile or continuous delivery, or trying to do platform re-architecting as they sort of scaled out and developed. 2017, I ended up leaving ThoughtWorks after 14 years, which is a long time as a consultant. So that's just very rare in general. But I decided to become a CTO for the scale up here in Berlin, because I was able to then sort of have the reins of, you kind of think of it as authority, but also accountability. And that's one thing that you sort of miss a little bit as a consultant, is that I always had to sort of work through other people who had that sort of formal authority or accountability. And there's nothing like being responsible or accountable for the decisions that you make that really make you think about, am I making the right choice? And so that's something that I felt I could add a lot of value in, particularly for a company that was going through a lot of rapid growth, helping them not just in the technology team, but helping the company look at how to structure communication and leadership. And I had a lot of fun doing that. And then at the end of last year, I had a lot of requests from other technical leaders to help them with their organizations. And obviously being full-time in a single organization, that doesn't really become possible, which is one of the reasons I'm a lot more independent now. So I do a combination of things like what you're mentioning before around training online now through the Tech Lead Academy, but I also do a lot of sort of coaching and mentoring of particularly VP engineering and CTOs. Because my belief is if I can help them with their sort of challenges or help them grow, then I help everyone in that organization, particularly all the technologists, grow as well. So I can have a lot more impact that way.
Cool. No, thanks a lot for all that detail. Sounds like an amazing journey you've been on. Like, I remember looking at ThoughtWorks back in the day, I think early on in my career, and yeah, I was always fascinated by, I think when new people join, they go through some training boot camp where like you get to learn like the right way to code, the right practices and everything, so that everyone's always aligned, which I always found really cool. And ThoughtWorks is really good at sharing the content to the rest of the community. Quite a few big people like Martin Fowler and everyone else who shares content outside of ThoughtWorks. So they're quite well known, and I'm sure the experience there was amazing. Yeah, I think out of you've just sort of gone into what my next question was going to be, which is about you've now decided to run your own business and around tech leadership, and perhaps you've spoken. I was going to say, tell us more about that. You've spoken a bit about it, but perhaps maybe chat a bit more on how it's actually going. How's that transition been like? Do you feel, some people say that when they go independent and they start their own thing, they're like, I should have been doing this all my life. Has it felt like that? Or yeah, maybe a bit more around that.
Yeah, so I guess, I count myself as being quite lucky because I guess I had some signs before I decided to go independent that I would be able to, commercially be able to sustain this. So, that's been really good. And that, I've had a lot of inbound requests. If you go independent, one of the challenges I know a lot of people have is trying to do that sort of brand building or awareness of, here is a service and getting it out there to people. But one of the reasons I started down this path is because I know this as a sort of CTO is, when you're sort of, if you think about it as the sort of the top of the technology sort of hierarchy, it's very easy to feel lonely, right? And everyone feels this at different levels within their own sort of organization. If you're like a tech lead or a team lead, you feel like you're by yourself. Sometimes you actually have peers, perhaps in different teams or, in a different company. But so the higher you go up, the more it feels like you are alone. Of course, you can also tap into a peer network of people, but there's definitely a sort of value and to having people, and this is something that I definitely appreciated, of having sort of coaching, of being able to talk through issues in a safe space with people that could help you talk through those issues. Now, I think with coaching, there's lots of different styles to this. So you can get full-time executive coaches that are very much about helping you dive deeply into how you're thinking about things. But one of the sort of areas that I tend to focus on is particularly the scale-up CTOs. So if you've joined a startup or a scale-up, you just don't have time for anything, right? So it feels like you're reacting quite a lot. And as an organization grows and scales, there are sort of common problems or patterns associated with growing an organization. So it might be about how you structure teams. It might be about how you structure like growth paths for people. It might be about sort of technical direction and maybe if and when to pay back technical debt. And so a lot of people in those roles kind of appreciate also having somebody who understands the context of that as well. So I'm not like a pure coach from that side, because I can also offer different perspectives, but I still try to play this sort of coaching role, which is really not trying to provide the solution, because I want people to still own the decisions that they make. But I want to help people understand perhaps the trade-offs, what things could actually happen, perhaps things that might be positives or things that might be negatives, depending on which side you're affected by change, perhaps. But it's ultimately them that are making the decision, and I'm helping them perhaps learn about that. So what I try to offer is, I guess, a lot more of the experience of what I've seen through many different companies, provide stories about how I've seen it work, but also maybe some of the secondary effects that people don't really anticipate when they're sort of making change or they're trying to improve something. But it's also really to help people sort of accelerate their own learning and support. So, now I've probably got a circle of probably about 6 or 7 people that I'm sort of coaching regularly. That sort of has built up over summer. Like everyone else, I've had to pivot my own business as well, because at the beginning of the year, it was all supposed to be like in-person workshops, which obviously you can imagine that didn't really quite go down. I think early March, the first or second week of March was like the last workshop I held in person. And then like everyone else had to sort of adapt. And I'm very grateful that, a lot of the stuff that we can do in technology can be done remotely, right? So we have such amazing technology, bandwidth, all of this sort of opportunity to be able to like talk over Zoom or, interactive whiteboards and things that it's a lot richer than what it would have been maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm very grateful for that. The second part of what I do is really this training course, and I have like 2 modes of that. So I have like a self-paced online training, that's the Tech Lead Academy. So this is where you can sign up for a course and you can sort of take it whenever you like. You can come back to it and revisit that. And then I had to sort of rebuild some of my material, which was like the idea of online sort of in-person workshops, but done online. And I'm kind of realistic in that you can't really run a 2-day workshop like direct over Zoom. Like everyone just gets exhausted. So I had to rebuild a lot of that. And one of the workshops that I've been offering probably since end of September is something called Shortcut to Tech Leadership. And it's a 3-hour workshop. I'm sort of extending it to 4 now. And it's a workshop that I'm actually leading online with interactive exercises optimized for an online experience, where there's sort of discussion, there's some sort of whiteboard activities or group activities. And it's really touching this topic of particularly not necessarily VP engineering or CTOs, but really first-time technical leaders. So typically they're your lead engineer or an engineer stepping into a tech lead or an engineering manager role, depending on how a company likes to describe it. And then that's keeping my time quite busy, actually.
Cool. Thank you. You spoke a little bit there about how you're happy that like technology, a lot of things can be done remotely. And yeah, of course, remote work has been fast-tracked a little bit by the pandemic. A lot of companies that perhaps had not even considered it or were just thinking about it ended up having to implement it and put it in place. Interested to know what remote leadership looks like, and if there are any sort of differences or things technical leaders should watch out for when they're leading people remotely versus in person.
Yeah, I think leading remotely is much more difficult because you can't really rely on a lot of body language, right? So when you're physically in the same room, you can sort of see if people are like closed, like folded arms, or as you're talking, they may be like stepping back. And I think there's 2 things that make it difficult, particularly at the moment, because one is like the forced remoteness, in that I know of some team members where it's not the most ideal working scenario working from home. I used to live in London, and in London, it's quite common for a lot of flats not to even have a living room, for instance, because it's been converted into a bedroom. And so, a lot of people don't have that space that you might have an office to sort of do that. I've also heard comments in regions where they've gone remote And then they've opened up some of the office, and some people are actually happy to go back into the office because it creates a little bit more focus time, right? So whereas you have this like workspace and you have like a sort of living space or your home space. And so that's an interesting thing. And as a leader, you have to be a lot more aware of, or at least perhaps forgiving about understanding that everyone's going to be in a different situation, and you probably don't know what that is, right? Like depending on how your relationship is with people, personal life tends to stay mostly personal, depending on individuals. And so that's something that you have to be aware of when you're leading people remotely, is that people might be working in a situation which is not ideal, but they're not willing to share that with you right now, right? That's a lot harder. I think one of the other things is, when you're, in a team room with people, you can sort of watch the dynamics between people. And so when you're trying to lead a team and you're sort of trying to understand what are the smells, it takes a little bit longer in a remote context because you're trying to do this through maybe emails or through Slack. And there's a sort of trade-off with written communication, is that we lose a lot of the tone, the emotion. And we might misinterpret things, like we might, read something with a different tone than what was intended, which happens all the time. Or, we might sort of miss that somebody was trying to say something important, but you might have read it without any sort of urgency in it, right? And so that becomes a lot harder, I think, in a remote context, which is really trying to connect into that sort of the emotional state of people in your team, and then also the dynamics with the people within that team, is that it's a lot harder because the feedback loops are a lot longer. And I think that's something that a lot of people sort of struggle with around that. I think for some earlier technical leaders, one of the early challenges is this thing about sort of control, right? So I think a lot of people, when they first move into a technical leadership role, they sort of want to watch everyone very closely. It might be, in a remote context, like checking every single check-in that everyone is doing and like reviewing every single line of code. And that sort of trust thing becomes a lot harder because you don't have the normal mechanisms of people in that same room. And so actually that is also an interesting thing for a lot of first-time leaders, is that they have to sort of quickly learn to sort of perhaps trust their team a bit more, or they're going to really frustrate their team very quickly. And so I think that's definitely another challenge for a lot of people going remote, if they haven't been doing remote for a while.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Yeah, I think I've most of my career was in office, and then obviously moved to remote first, and then now full remote as a result of the pandemic. And yeah, it's interesting how, like you mentioned, some of these things get lost, and just even just before a meeting in an in-office setup, you probably like wait outside the meeting room 5 minutes before and have a bit of back and forth chat, whether it's social chat or perhaps a problem someone's going through, and help them to solve it. And when you're now in an online setup, it's usually everyone just dials in and kicks off. Everything becomes like a bit like more robotic. So yeah, something interesting that we do at our companies, for at least the longer meetings, we always try to have an icebreaker before the start of the meeting, just to help ease up people's minds and also get to know people a bit more, and still have that social environment, even though you are like remote.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that deliberateness as well is really key, because you're right, is that people lose those informal, sort of ad hoc opportunities to build relationships. That interaction of maybe in the coffee tea room or over lunch, or, before or after a meeting. And that's something that's really key to building relationships and a high performing team of people trust. And I think some of the things that you talked about are like really great examples that people, like icebreakers within a meeting. I know of one technical leader where they do like a team meeting, and they send out like a tea sample. And so everyone like has like they brew the tea and they enjoy it at the same time, so that's kind of like informal like team building activity.
Yeah. Cool. I want to move to maybe diversity of building teams. It's a topic that comes up often these days, whether it's gender diversity or racial diversity. And I think it's an important topic in a South African context. So yeah, perhaps maybe if you can chat a little bit about what your thoughts around building diverse teams and creating equal opportunities for people.
Yeah. So I count myself as very fortunate because I think one of the things with ThoughtWorks is that they really focused on diversity and inclusion. And I think those two need to go together. And I'll come back to why in a second. But, I think over a lot of the teams that I worked in, we, always had some sort of female representation on the technical team as well. And I am always stunned, and you actually have this quite badly in Germany, where a lot of engineers have never worked in a team with like a female engineer. And I think that's an interesting thing. There's a lot of research around diversity, and the most recent one that I read was from BCG. I think it was 2017 or 18. And they correlated, high performance businesses, and particularly business revenue from new products, so innovation. And they worked out that there were 4 factors that affected that. I'm always bad at remembering all of them, but I think one of them was like gender, one of them was industry background, one of them was different sort of career paths. 2 things that they did look at but didn't actually have an impact in their study was age, so age doesn't matter so much, and also your educational background, so in terms of what you studied. For me, anecdotally, that's really interesting, just because like I've met so many people who in technology come from so many different walks of life, like philosophy, maybe they've studied, or not studied formally at a university, and they can, they're so effective at learning that they can contribute. And I think the science that sort of studies diversity, one of the things about it is it also kind of depends on what you're trying to optimize for. So, if you have a very static environment and you're trying to be efficient, then diversity is a distraction from that perspective. But where it's very helpful is in particularly highly complex changing environments. And that's very much our world of technology, right? So nothing stays static. You put a business online and there'll be suddenly other competitors there as well, right? And so that's where diversity makes a lot of difference, because it allows you to be adaptive to different environments. One of my favorite books that I like to talk about this is the Strengths Finder book. And what I really appreciated from the Strengths Finder book is that it helps you, it gives you a vocabulary for identifying different strengths. But the point is that you can't be good at everything, right? So, we talk about generalists, but, we often talk about T-shaped people. So like, we have a depth in one area, but we are a generalist in another sort of area. But we can't be a deep sort of, experience in all areas. It's just impossible. But we can be better as a team if we're working with people with sort of different sort of depths, as long as we can work together. And so that's where I think, the science of diversity is really key, because you need that sort of breadth of experience, breadth of skill, different perspectives to be able to solve and cope with the changing environment. So that's one thing about like diversity, why I think it's super important. The second thing I think is then the inclusion part, right? Because one of the sort of interesting consequences of diversity is that you might have people that communicate in different styles or have different opinions. And this is why you need fairly strong leadership, in that you need to be able to create an environment where people can surface these differences. But of course, the team won't necessarily benefit if the team can't agree on an approach, right? And so, you need inclusion so people feel safe to bring up an opinion. The Google Research in High Performing Teams talks about psychological safety being the first sort of basis of high performing teams. And one of the sort of indicators for psychological safety is, when people are polled for this, it's can you give your opinion openly without the fear of repercussion, right? And in a lot of environments with teams, it might be the fear or repercussion of shame. Like, I'm saying something that's not accepted by the group. Or the fear of ridicule, which is like, people will laugh at me because they might say, oh, well, of course, that's a stupid idea. Why would we go with that? And so good leadership is like trying to build up that psychological safety for inclusion, so that people can sort of give their opinion, and so we can actually surface all of these different approaches. And so teams won't benefit from that diversity if people aren't inclusive, and particularly if you are a minority in a bigger group, and it doesn't really matter what that is. You sort of feel an imbalance anyway in terms of being able to express your opinion, because you kind of are by definition a minority, and you sort of feel like, is it because I'm the minority, or is it because of what I'm saying? And so that becomes a challenging thing. So inclusion is super important. And then when you have all these diverse opinions, then you might be able to cherry pick the sort of best parts of the different sort of solutions. And so this is where Scott E. Page, who's a professor, I don't know if it's still a professor, but it was a professor at University of Michigan, where he studied a lot about the sort of mathematics and science behind diversity and where it makes sense. And this is what, he studied some of the interesting cases where, the best solutions that emerge out of really diverse teams are often very rarely like a single proposal of one of the solutions. It's often like a mixture of all these different ideas blended together, and you're sort of trying to take the best of all these different worlds. And so, I think diversity and inclusion is really key, I think, in technology, because, we are going to be dealing with very random, unpredictable scenarios in the future. We need people to share all the expertise they can have, all the different opinions, even though it may sound stupid or not right to us. It might actually help us solve a solution because we didn't think about it, and it might be even simpler. And so that's something that I really think about when I lead and build organizations, about not just focusing on the diversity, but also focusing on the inclusion. And really trying to make sure that people feel safe so that they can contribute those ideas. Otherwise, your team or organization doesn't really benefit from the diversity.
Cool. Thanks a lot for that. I think that was very insightful. Yeah, I've always found it interesting and tricky, because I've been on diverse teams that have done very well, and I understand the full value of like having ideas from people from different backgrounds and everything. But I've also understood that when people get along, psychological safety becomes easier to achieve, and that's sometimes easier when people are quite similar, they do the same things generally, and but I think from what I'm hearing from you, it also becomes a responsibility of leadership when you create a diverse team to then build that psychological safety and build that inclusion that you've spoken of, to allow that to happen and for people to thrive. But,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that you touched upon there, and I think this is something that all of you engineering leaders face, is particularly when you're hiring, I think a lot of people focus on sort of culture fit.
Yeah.
And culture fit is a little bit dangerous depending on how you interpret it, because some people use culture fit as they're not like me kind of thing, right? And that then is very subject to implicit biases, and we're all biased. Like I'm biased, I admit it, right? Like we all have our human faults. And so the important thing I think when you're hiring is, if you are going to focus on something like culture fit, is that it's very important to be able to articulate what do you mean by that. Because I think, I've been in a lot of interview situations where a team member says, no, I don't want to hire them because they're not a good culture fit. And then I ask them, why not? And if they can't really explain why, then it's very much about the sort of implicit biases that they, like, I don't think I can work with this person, right? And then, okay, so it might be about how they collaborate. What did they say that made you, what did they do during the interview that gave you that sense of that? And you're really trying to drill down into, if you are going to go down the culture fit sort of route, you have to be able to articulate as an organization, as an engineering leader, what do you mean by, what is your culture? How do people behave according to that culture? What are their expectations to that? Which is why it's important to have documented sort of culture expectations as a team and an organization. Because if you don't have that, then you really are sort of leaning on implicit biases, which is like not very good for hiring.
Cool. Thank you. I think when you're speaking a bit about diversity and inclusion, you spoke a bit about high-performing teams, which I think is interesting. As technical leaders, or as a tech leader, how do you know when you have a high performing team? What does that actually look like? I think that's something people are always wondering, like, is my team a high performing team, and what does that even mean? So I don't know what your thoughts around that are.
Yeah, it's hard because I get asked this question quite a lot as well. The other one is like, how do you measure a high performing team? Like, what's the thing that you measure? And I'll say that it's not really a single measure. There are certain traits that I look for. And it's a little bit different if you're part of that team versus like maybe you're a manager or you're away from that team. Because I think one of the things that I'd be looking for if I'm part of that team is, a high performing team. I talked about that psychological safety thing, right? So as an example, if somebody is struggling with something, I watch how long it is before they get sort of help or before other people in their team offer to help them. If people are offering to sort of help each other and unblock each other really rapidly without being asked, that's like one indicator because, a team is focused on the team, not just on being an individual and being effective by themselves. So, a high performing team I would see as, people who are willing to ask for help and they get that help relatively rapidly. And also people are sort of generous with their knowledge in terms of like sharing their expertise or their experience. Because there's always opportunity for us to learn from other people because they'll have different experiences and different sort of strengths. When I think about this from an outside perspective, one of the things that I'd be looking for is kind of like, A, is the team, moving towards their mission, whatever that is, right? So are they delivering value effectively? If you have a more internal team, like a platform team, it's like, are they actually delivering perhaps tooling or processes that are helping the rest of the organization? So, are they focused on delivering value? Do you see sort of progress towards that? I'd obviously be looking at like the sort of maybe the attrition from the team as well. And attrition is like one of those things where it's a little bit hard because you might have people leaving to join other teams because people have grown really rapidly through that team. And I've seen that, like, people where, everyone has grown so quickly that they're all ready to take on more responsibility or, the challenges of that team aren't so interesting for them anymore. And that's perfectly fine as well. But there is another type of attrition, which is, people who are disengaged. And so that's something that I'd be looking for, which is, people who are like looking to go to another team because they're bored, or people leaving the company because they don't see any more opportunities. So I think that's something that I'd be looking for from a sort of team. And then I think the other aspect is, is there a sort of sense of improvement or you might argue it's like risk management as well from the team. So for me, a high performing team shouldn't need too much attention from the organization. So, if I compare, like if I'm looking at say 3 or 4 different teams, at any instance, one team might need a little bit more help. But if a team is constantly having, arguments, discussions that get escalated or, production issues because like their system keeps falling over, then that team isn't maybe managing technical quality well, or they're not sort of leading or mediating conflict very well. And so, then it requires sort of more energy and attention from the organization to sort of help them along. So there's some of the things that I would look for as indicators for a high-performing team.
Cool. Yeah, I like what you spoke about attention there at the end. I think I forgot where I read it, but something around a high-performing team. A leader knows they've sort of got a high-performing team when they can almost be pulled out of that team or taken out, and the team will continue to function for a long while. Without needing their support. And I think that it aligns with the whole organization supporting that team. The team almost becomes autonomous and knows what to do and make decisions by themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing of, if you're a good leader, then you're creating space for everyone on your team to take on leadership opportunities. And that's a really good litmus test for a lot of leaders, is like, can you take a holiday? Like, can you take a week off without worrying about stuff? If you're like checking email, or if you're like responding to things in Slack or whatever on that break, there's probably something you haven't done to sort of delegate or grow that team to be high performing. Whereas, I do encourage like technical leaders to aim to a point where they should be able to turn off their email for a week or 2, and they shouldn't be fearful of what may happen.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna start jumping to questions from everyone else. Then I'll just maybe have one more to just wrap up from my side because a couple of questions have been submitted. So I'm just gonna
Great.
pick as I go. I think this might be slightly related to what we've been speaking about. So I guess the first one is when the team is simply not achieving the short-term deliverables, I felt I had to resort to micromanagement to get us over the line. How do I prevent this? So that's one of the questions there.
Yeah. I think it depends on how you define micromanagement. So I think it makes sense if a team is struggling to maybe take a little bit more directive action. So my preference is always to default to coaching or questioning first. So I'd like to understand what's stopping them from delivering. Like, is it I have a background or like an interest in sort of systems thinking, and one of the things that I learned through systems thinking is really understanding that a lot of behavior through people or teams is typically generated by what people or what the system is generating. And the system, when I think about engineering, might be about your prioritization process, or around clarity of responsibility. So, one of the first things I would first do if I see a team struggling to deliver what they need to do is I would do a lot of exploration and asking about what's actually happening, right? Because I really want to understand what are the things that have contributed to the situation. It might be that the team is being pulled into three different directions by three leaders in the organization saying that their thing is like the topmost thing. And so if that's the issue, then you probably need to have the conversation with those leaders, whatever department or team that they're coming from, to actually resolve that. The team won't be able to solve that potentially by themselves. If it is about actually the team, that's a clear mission, clear breakdown, and maybe they're not necessarily producing results, that would be a different conversation. But part of the art is trying to orient to try to understand what the hotspots are, to understand where you actually delve in. And so if it's like an internal issue, or you believe it's an internal issue to the team, then I'd be sort of asking questions around, what has the team tried? How does the team currently work? And is it a sort of a knowledge or an experience problem? Because if it's a knowledge thing, so for instance, like the team doesn't know how to break up work into smaller chunks, then then I can be a lot more directive, and I know how to sort of step in, because I need to show them perhaps how to break that up, because they just don't have that knowledge, or they haven't found that knowledge somehow. And so that's fine to be able to then sort of jump in and sort of do that. My role is not always to sort of get to a point where I'm sort of telling everyone to do, because the thing that I'm always thinking about is really about how am I sort of improving the system as I sort of deal with these topics. I recently posted a blog about double loop learning. It's a concept that's been around for a long time, but there's sort of a mode that you think about as a leader, which is you don't just solve the problem right now. And that's what I think of when I think about micromanagement, right? So I'll come in, I'll sort of do the work. I should be thinking about how do I actually make the sort of system better or sustainable. So, if I'm not doing that work, who would be doing it if I leave that team, for example, right? And so it goes back to that sort of definition of that leadership that we were talking about, which is if I'm coming in to micromanage, I should also be doing that with an aim to be using it as a teaching moment to make sure that the team understands how to maybe resolve that again, right? So if it's the problem with the different leaders, it might be about having the process that brings them all to the same place to highlight this sort of conflict in priorities. That might be the teaching moment there. But that's kind of the two modes that I would be thinking about. So my focus would be really about exploring the situation and really trying to understand what has led the team into this sort of situation, and then how much sort of directive action that I take is kind of a little bit more dependent on what you find out. But hopefully your team has been learning and growing, and you want to sort of teach or share the knowledge to get them to the next point where they can be more independent. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think it does quite deep, quite some detail there. Thank you. The next one, yeah, I'm starting from the top now. Did you face any big challenges going from leading teams to leading teams of teams? If so, what were they and how did you approach them?
To be honest, I didn't notice it myself. I know people who go in that transition um, and have a lot more challenges. And I think it's because a lot of the times when I was working as a consultant, um, I had so much variety with the different types of teams. So as an example, I spent some time doing agile coaching full time. And part of that meant working with perhaps like a PMO, project management office. And so meant working across many, many teams. And so one of the interesting things there is like you have to be able to deal with variety. You have to deal with like context switching, right? So one team is very different from another team. You kind of have to deal with like teams at different stages. So like if I think about it from an agile adoption perspective, like one team might be very, very traditional waterfall-ish. Another team might be like perfectly fine with iterative planning, constant like continuous delivery. And so that's one of the challenges that I think leaders who are leading teams have to be able to deal with, which is context and differences in context. So it's not only the stage of where that team is at, but then also adapting your own style to particularly perhaps the leaders of that sort of area, right? And so I think one thing that also helped me is because I've sort of taught and helped a lot of other technical leaders is that I start to understand that there are all these different sort of styles. And so as a lead of leads, you have to be able to sort of almost adapt your own style depending on, the people that you're working with. So as an example, you might have some leaders that are, you probably notice I'm a little bit detail oriented, is that I give very specific kind of information. Other leaders might be very more abstract, right? So they might give you a one-liner about what the status of a project is or an issue. And those people you might need to actually dive into the detail to actually explore, have they got a handle of this? Do they need a lot of help? What's the kind of sort of state of that, right? Other people will need a lot more time to explain a particular topic. Other people will be like very direct and straightforward. And so that's another challenge that a lot of leads of leads get surprised by, which is you can't lead everyone exactly the same way, right? And when you're leading other leads, it's like, just because somebody's leading differently from how you would lead that team doesn't mean it's wrong. Right. And so that's something that you also have to be a lot more aware of, which is like your own style and adapting your style to work with other people.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I guess it can also be quite challenging if the transition happens too quickly. So from individual contributor, then you go straight to leading a team, and then somehow, before you've had multiple experiences as a team lead, then you're already leading teams or teams, and yeah.
Yeah, it's a trap a lot of engineers and really rapidly growing have, because they see it as a good thing to climb the ladder very fast. And actually, I don't think it is, because it like creates a lot of stress, where it's like you haven't quite mastered something before you're trying something else, and you end up being like this sort of dogmatic person because you've learned one thing at that stage, you apply everywhere, and you leave like a trail of trauma because you're not sort of being adaptive and creating the right space for different people at different times, and you've moved on to the next thing and you may not actually realize what's actually happening. So I do encourage people when they're learning something to not just do it once, but to do it several times in different contexts, because you'll then really truly develop your skill, develop a broader toolkit, and be a lot more adaptive.
I had a manager who used to say you need to live in an area long enough to learn the mistakes you introduced when you started there, and understand what you should do differently next time. So
it's a good one.
Cool. And then we've also got an interesting one here, which is what has been your favorite training / mentoring moment where you've made a really big impact?
Ooh. Oh, this is really hard. It's really funny because some of this sort of stuff you get really, like with leadership and these roles, your feedback loops are a lot longer, right? So as a developer, you get immediate feedback when you're working with a computer, but when you're leading people, it's a lot longer. There's a conference in the UK called the Lead Dev Conference, and I was speaking there last year, I think it was, when things could still be in person. And somebody came up to me in the break and they said, oh, hey, Pat, like I saw you at the very first Lead Dev conference. This was like 5 years ago. I was on my first like technical leadership role, and your talk really helped me open up my eyes. And now I'm like a head of engineering or something like this, like 5 years later. But, wanted to really sort of thank you for that. And, I really love being able to help people on that, because like I'm pretty much self-learned other than reading a lot of books myself. I've never done like a training course. So, being able to give people a sort of leg up and help people on that journey is like really satisfying for me. So for me, that's like one of my most favorite moments around that. But I do want to share another quick story, which is when I was actually doing this agile coaching sort of role, I was working closely with the PMO head. So it was a large telecom community, and they had a project management office. I think they had something like 120 different project managers. So it's a very, very large company. I don't even know how many people they had then. But I was working with the head of the PMO and her assistant. And her assistant was ex-IBM. And she saw her role as like enforcing process. And so, you can imagine from a software perspective, you get someone coming along, are you following the process, right? And so that was kind of like her defining her identity associated with the role, because it was the thing that was valued when she was working at IBM. It was the thing that was valued in a telecommunications sort of company. And as we were going on this agile sort of journey, I remember this conversation, I think it was probably about 2 months in, and she came up to me and said, Pat, I think I've been doing the wrong thing my entire life. And I was like, what do you mean by that? It's like, I think I've been like the police that, that nobody wants to have, that, tells everyone they're doing the wrong thing, to sort of cross their T's, dot their I's, complete forms, that wasn't adding value. And I could see this like, moment which is like lights clicking on, but also a moment of like unsafety of like, I don't know how to redefine myself. And I think this is something which is like, okay, you meant the right thing, like prime directive, retrospective prime directive. You did the right thing based on what you knew and based on what the system was asking you to do. And the question that I posed to her was, how can you add value in this new world, given what you know, with agile sort of methods? And this is where she turned her sort of role around from sort of being the person that chased everyone for forms and completed process to actually being an enabler, right? So helping people where people were struggling with the process to actually understand why it was there, what was the gaps, and how they could actually, why they needed to help that process, or if there are different ways to fulfill the same need, and if it was training needed or things like that. So she turned into a bit more like facilitation. But I think that was another fun sort of light bulb moment, which I was able to help with.
That's really cool and inspiring. I think you often think if people have been doing something for years, that it's very difficult for them to switch into like a better approach. So it's always great to see that. And yeah, and I think the Lead Dev conference that you actually mentioned, I attended the New York one last year in April, and it's actually one of the inspirations for coming back and organizing the one here at this site, the Tech Leadership Meetup this site. So yeah, that's really great, and that community just seems to have been growing more and more even up to this day. So it's really cool. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to get one more question from the audience, yeah, and then there's one also, the final one will be one that's from the audience that's very aligned to what was going to be one of my closing questions, so that will be the last one. But from the audience, I'll just pull this one, which I think is a very good question. It's a bit related to some of the things you've already mentioned. So it's developers yearn for growth, and as such generally become bored once they've mastered the domain. What are some ways of keeping developers growing to lengthen their tenure or their stay at a company?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, is that bored people quit. And so one of the challenges for every leader is trying to find opportunities for them to learn something. There's many different opportunities for that. So one of the interesting challenges is you have to have a pretty good sense about like what the background of your team have been doing. So what have they done in the past? What have they learned? Because what is boring to one person is often an opportunity for somebody else to grow. And so one of my favorite ways of like when I'm working in a team to do this is sort of simply mixing up roles, right? Or mixing up responsibilities. So getting somebody to do something that they don't normally do because it'll help them build a different skill or just appreciation for a different element. And it could be everything from, maybe somebody takes care of the build infrastructure for that team and they're always the people that fix the build when it goes wrong. And maybe using it as an opportunity to grow people, to sort of get them to learn something about the build infrastructure. For other people, it might be about giving them an opportunity to represent the team in a different sort of external meeting. So to represent or agree an API contract with a different team that you would normally do, but actually it's a good opportunity for them to sort of take part of that. So, I always try to think about like, mixing up responsibilities and then, always trying to delegate or grow people to take care of things that you normally do. So make yourself, possibly redundant in terms of the tasks that you have. That's typically a win-win because it means that you can normally go back to more coding or at least you get more time, or when you go on holidays, you don't have to worry about that so much. So, but it's contingent on you knowing what people have done in the past. So, what is a new growth opportunity, but also seeing what you have in your existing environment as well.
Cool. Thank you. And yeah, and then just to wrap up with the questions, I guess one everyone is probably interested in is how much code do you still write these days? You're obviously involved in a lot of tech leadership and you're coaching technical leaders. How do you, if you're not writing any code, or if you're not writing as much, how do you still keep up to date with what's happening in the tech world to still have a good, strong opinion on it? So a couple of things there, I guess.
Yeah, so I don't write that much code, but I still dabble in writing little programs for myself. So as an example, Level Up, right? The newsletter that I have, the analytics isn't so good. So one of the tasks that I wanted to find out, for instance, was I'm preparing for the end of the year. And one of the things I want to do is like include the most read articles. And so there's like a page, and unfortunately you can't really export any JSON or anything like this. And so I basically written a little Kotlin program that does some scraping that allows me to trawl through all the newsletters, extract out all the links and also the corresponding numbers so I can actually work out which ones are the most read. So I write little sort of scrappy little programs like this to sort of get an understanding about how languages are developing. But for me, I always need a good reason to write code. So I'm very driven by value. And for a lot of the things that I do, it's often like maybe a once off. So it doesn't make sense to automate something if you're just doing it once. It's like a lot of effort. So I need to have a good reason to actually code something. And one of the reasons I feel comfortable about this is like, I don't have any problem saying, I don't know about that, or I don't know about that, but I'll learn it quickly if I have to. And the things that tend to last a lot longer are really your awareness of sort of patterns and principles. And you may need to relearn them in how it gets sort of done in that particular language or framework. But when you think about like asynchronous communication, you think about event buses and all the different sort of communication patterns there. They don't really change that much. So I dabble around, and I'm confident that if I have to, I'd be able to learn things quite quickly. But I don't do that much coding these days.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm sure the experience from the consulting days helped expose you to a lot of different approaches to maybe similar problems, and then you almost learned these principles, and they're quite strong in your head already. So yeah. I think that makes sense. Pat, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge with us out here in South Africa. To everyone in the audience, patkua.com. If you want to know more details about Pat and everything he's been doing, if you're on Twitter, it's @PatKua. And that Level Up newsletter, I would encourage everyone to subscribe. You get in content in your inbox every Sunday, and there's always something there that's interesting to read and learn about. It's customary from the Tech Leadership Group to give a book to the guest. who joins us for a meetup. So we'll be in touch after this to find out what book you'll be keen on getting. Hopefully not one of your own books. But, Benny, that's courtesy of Benny's company. Benny's one of the organizers, Matchbox Solutions. So thanks to Benny for that. But yeah, thanks a lot to everyone who's joined us. Thanks a lot to everyone who's joined us throughout the year. We'll reconnect in January. And yeah, we'll be making decisions as we go along next year on in-person meetups and doing it online. It feels like we might be doing both at some point because there are some benefits to each one of them. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And Pat, thanks once again.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.